How's it going, comrades? You are listening to Historically, a show where we decolonize history and debunk myths and misinformation taught to you in schools and on corporate media. I'm JD, and this is my co-host Isha, and we're joined by Brandon Winters.
It's time to end the mythologizing of Thanksgiving, and it's time for us to face who the Pilgrims and the colonial settlers were in their heart and their minds. Today, for our special Thanksgiving episode, Matt Lech from the Majority Report joins us. He also has a podcast called Literary Hangover, where he discusses the intersection between history and literature. Thank you for joining us, Matt.
So do you want to tell the audience what Literary Hangover is and what you do there?
Yeah, Literary Hangover is sort of like my book club podcast where I discuss history through the lens of fiction, mainly American history. And now we're in the sort of colonial times, so the 1600s and 1700s. And we use sort of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter and books like that to elucidate sort of what they do show us about history and what they sort of mask and missed about it.
Amazing. It kind of sounds like a good dovetail with our podcast, which is just about history. So how do they find your podcast?
It's on YouTube and all the places you usually get podcasts at Literary Hangover, and also patreon.com/literary hangover.
Okay. That's good. Yeah, please be sure to check it out. Thank you for coming on to our Thanksgiving episode. And who were the original inhabitants of the Massachusetts area before contact with the people we call Pilgrims?
That's a good question. I mean, mainly, of course, the general answer is Native American and indigenous peoples. I would say the general term, at least that I've picked up, especially in Massachusetts and Connecticut area, is Wampanoag. And this sort of branches off into a number of different types of groups. And I'm not the best expert on that, but the Pequots is one of those.
And the Pequots lived in Massachusetts?
Connecticut.
Connecticut. Were they part of the Iroquois Confederacy?
I think the Iroquois Confederacy, I believe, develops a little bit later and a bit more upstate New York. I think they preceded the Confederacy.
Can you describe first contact happened with the colonial settlers?
Yeah, there's a few, my understanding, there's a few early settlements in the late 1500s. Or throughout the 1500s, but Northeast and especially in New England, it starts once you get into the 1600s. So basically you have Dutch New York and then English Massachusetts sort of developing and growing, and Massachusetts is splintering off in a lot of new areas, and you get Rhode Island developing there. And the Pequots are sort of right in the middle of those three, which is sort of where you get the conflict. And, we'll get to, I'm sure, the massacre a bit later, but as these new European colonists are entering in the area, as trade is increasing, and that also includes germs. And so you have a bunch of tribes getting sick from diseases that have been developing on Eurasia, and those antibodies have been traveling the Silk Road for thousands of years, and the indigenous people in the Americas weren't prepared for them, biologically speaking.
The British had kidnapped this the kid from one of the First Nations, and they called him Squanto. And when he came back, wasn't his entire tribe just missing?
Yeah, and there's this strange, and they didn't know how to interpret a lot of this stuff, so they took it as, oh, this is just our land and God's clearing it for us. Because when they would bring Native Americans back to Europe, they would die very quickly, obviously, because the germs would be much greater over there that they weren't prepared for than, would happen to the United States. And with the sophistication, the scientific sophistication or lack thereof, people took it as, this is a fragile new world, but there's something sort of something spiritual about it that's causing the death, and it's providence, I guess, is how they decided to interpret it.
First group of settlers besides the Virginia Company, they were very religious. Like, how did their religion fit or differ from the Church of England, for example?
Basically you have the Separatins and the Puritans, and I'm not sure exactly how to define all these different groups, but my understanding is you have a bunch of issues with regards to church and state and the English Revolution festering over, and basically you have a bunch of pilgrims that want to come over, and they think that the Church of England is too corrupted along the lines of, let's say, like the Catholic Church. It's too idolatrous and too this or that. And they want to go back to more fundamentalist understanding of the Bible and what it means for them in the world, and the New World gives them the ability to do that. It should also point out that, like, the Mayflower, for instance, wasn't just coming over here to bring furs. It wasn't just coming over here to bring settlers and new pilgrims. It was also a fur trading vessel, and I believe, maybe if it's not the Mayflower, one of these other big ships that we know the name of that brought pilgrims over, also its next stop was the Caribbean to move slaves. So as part of this the spiritual stuff is important, but I also think the economic, how the Northeast was basically another leg on the slave trade, and a less important one than Africa or the Caribbean, but one to maintain ships and that sort of thing.
Because what you were saying about fur, that was like efforts to control access to the fur trade that was one of the causes of war, right? Or that led to the Pequot War?
Yeah, one of many. Okay. The material. There's a bunch of material sort of confluences in the Pequot War. So the first thing is, we've already mentioned diseases a little bit, but the Pequots were spared a bit more than some of the neighboring tribes from getting decimated by diseases. So they were in a decent, more powerful shape, and they were more intimidating to settlers for that reason. And they were also situated on a part of the Connecticut and the ocean where there's Wampanoag shells, which were sort of sanded down into wampum, and it's sort of the ceremonial, sort of like historical accounting / also eventually when the settlers got their hands on it, became a sort of currency. And that was
right.
Probably, I would think, one of the main reasons that they had the target on their back. But yeah, they controlled a lot of fur trapping area land as well.
Were the English the first Europeans they made contact with, or was it Dutch or French?
These specific, I would say, is probably the Dutch. And the Dutch, for instance, I just mentioned the wampum. They brought machines over to help. Wampum was something that was made by hand and sanded down by the Pequots and the other Native Americans in the Northeast, and actually it's spreading throughout the whole northeastern part of the country. But the Dutch brought over a machine that could help them churn out a lot of it a lot faster, and I thought that was very characteristic of colonialist behavior.
Yeah. What were some of the other material factors in play that led to the war?
One of the things is the reasons they gave for attacking the Pequots are very tenuous when you look into it. There was a trader named John Oldham who was killed off of Block Island, off the coast of Long Island, and that is cited commonly by Winthrop and Bradford and Hubbard, the main sort of the time historians of the war, as one of the precipitating events. But Oldham wasn't killed by a Pequot; he was killed by a Narragansett-aligned, I believe, Neantic tribe, or a few from a band of Neantics, and it was clearly just a pretext. They were just ready to attack the Pequots, and the Narragansetts were aligned with Rhode Island and Roger Williams against the Pequots. So there's a bit of a divide and conquer stuff going on there too. But it's interesting that traders and the deaths of traders are the main citations for what provoked the war. And these traders aren't just traders of furs and wampum, but also of information. So you have Oldham carrying letters from Winthrop and to his son while in the run up to this war, and you can sort of track the movements of these traders. And there's another guy named Stone who was sort of a rabble rouser. He was like I guess cuckolded a man in Massachusetts and was run out of, I think, both New Amsterdam and Massachusetts. Oops. And then he was killed by some Native Americans too, and they all of a sudden acted like he was, someone they all liked, and how dare they kill Stone. And,
of course.
Yeah. So it's kind of like weapons of mass destruction. Like they kind of made up a reason because they already wanted to go to war.
It's so much like that. Like I don't think I said this on the episode, but like John Oldham is sort of like a World Trade Center, and you have let's see if I can map this analogy out. And then you have the Neantics, who I guess would be. No, I don't really want to try to do this, but yeah, it's false pretense. It's we're going to we're going to use the suffering of some individual as a pretext for basically murdering an entire group of people, and it's a very early pattern apparently.
Okay.
Yeah.
So next week, a lot of kids are going to be fed with horrible myths about the first Thanksgiving. So can you tell us what if you had a kid and you were going to tell it the truth, like how would it go about the first contact between the Pequot and the Pilgrims?
The tough thing is that while it is definitely mythologized and false, there's something true in that trade was a major way of communication between these groups, and it's hard. I mean, the Thanksgiving in general is just completely nonsensical. I don't know the specifics of what happened with that story. I have some vague memories, but my understanding is that the tribes that helped the Pilgrims there ended up treated terribly well themselves. My favorite thing regarding this topic is just to talk about Christopher Columbus and how basically it's the state power getting behind a lucky guy who managed to underestimate the size of the world, which allowed him to have the courage to try to cross an ocean that by his calculation should have been a lot smaller. But yeah, I don't know what I really say. My thing with I try not to just tell people they've been told lies with this stuff, but rather that make it a bit more granular, because I also talked about in a previous episode of Literary Hangover a guy named Thomas Morton, and him versus the Puritans is an interesting dynamic, because he was sort of just a big free trade sort of, I guess you would call it, proto-pirate type of guy, and everything goes, let's just trade, let's all have fun. And this is in the Maple of Marymount. His town is eventually cut down by the Puritans, who don't like the race mixing and don't like him trading guns to Native Americans, for instance. And so trade and communication between Native Americans and colonists is it's more complex than, it's especially more complex than just people helping people. Although I think the helpfulness of Native Americans to Pilgrims is one thing definitely to stress, because there's no way that any of the colonies would have survived without the trade relationships they built with communities that were already here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Differences between land use, and the English thought they were entitled to the land because in their minds the indigenous population wasn't using the land correctly.
Yeah.
Whatever. What was the difference between how indigenous people and natives, or indigenous people and English, use land and organized property?
Yeah, the basic difference is the English developed a bunch of different concepts. Vacuum decilium is the main one that sounds sort of, I guess maybe it sounds sort of Latin and rotative. What it really means is this land is empty, so we can use it. But in truth, the land wasn't empty. it was a lot of this was being used seasonally though, and so you have Native Americans that in a certain part of the year will be in one area because that's where the resources are for that time of year, and you move over it. And to be honest, the vacuum decilium, the justification didn't even last scrutiny contemporaneously. Like Roger Williams, the guy who started Rhode Island, was calling it out, and that's one of the reasons why he was eventually exiled from Massachusetts. Is he's like, it's clearly not empty land. We have to compensate. I mean, he would just say it belongs to them, and if they want us off it, we're gonna have to be out of here. And the one of the buzzwords to always look for this time is improvements. Are we improving the land? Meaning, are we like chopping down trees and building a field there? Are we, that sort of thing? And it's funny that they call it improvements. I think I was reading a book on it's some German naturalist, and he traveled to America, and they're talking about how Crevecoeur, the guy who wrote the reference, the French guy who wrote Democracy in America, and one of the de Tocqueville. I think de Tocqueville mentions that like chopping down trees to let the air go through is good for the environment. So it's that sort of thinking is and like how useful. And I will point out that like the Native American tribes in the area also affected their environment, but I think in more sustainable ways. They would burn areas, so like the underbrush would be burnt out, and then you'd have basically just newer growth forests that would be easier to hunt in because you could see the animals and from farther away and that sort of thing. So like the never a virgin land, let's say that the people here were already cultivating it and using it for their purposes.
So what happened? What happened around the 1630s that created this tinderbox before the war?
Yeah, there's a number of things. I think just the growth of the French and the Dutch and English settlements, but also a lot of scholars note a hurricane in 1635 that really put a lot of pressure on supplies. So, for instance, during the Mystic Massacre in 1637, before they actually burnt the entire village of women and children.
Wait.
Yeah. Well, I'll just leave it as getting corn was a huge motivator factor for why you would make an attack. And I believe one of the Pequot emissaries, when he finds out that, hey, we're actually going to go to war, like what's going on here? He says, we'll take some of your cattle and cows, and we're not afraid of you. That sort of thing. So these sorts of livestock was a huge livestock and food was a huge concern. It's mentioned that the English soldiers were hungry as they were preparing for the.
Originally, the Virginia colony was a for-profit corporation, so people had to prospect and send back valuables back to the shareholders. Mm-hmm. Was Massachusetts Bay Colony or Plymouth Colony just a colony owned by the Queen? Well, not owned, but whatever.
No, it was a similar type of arrangement. Where I think there's like different shareholders, but I can't be too specific about that. But I think it was similar to the Virginia settlements.
Okay, so that's what I thought. Okay, so who fired the first shot in the Pequot War?
Well, it sort of depends by which silly inciting incident that you decide was the real one. But definitely, it would have been. Really, the Mystic Massacre is the Pequot War.
Okay.
You have the killings of the traders and stuff before, but that's the first battle, and that's where it starts off.
Talk about the Mystic Massacre. Where is the Pequot village? And I guess it happened in May 26, 1637. So can you start with what happened in the morning and go into detail?
So basically what happened was, let's see, how do I want to organize this? where to start. Well, basically what happened is you have a bunch of English settlers, and the Mystic Massacre took place on what we now call the Thames River, which was renamed after the war. It was originally called the Pequot River in Connecticut. The Pequots notice a few English boats that look like a war party passing them heading to Rhode Island from the New York area, and they're not really sure what's going on. They're asking them, "Hey, what's up?" And they kind of get the sense that this is going to be bad. So the English sail past and then get on the island up northeast of them, and then them with allies from the Narragansetts, who they met up with in Rhode Island, march over to the Mystic Fort.
Oh, okay. So, hold on. So the English had another First Nation as an ally?
Yes, and that's one of the sort of confusing things here is, and I forget what his name is, but there was a Narragansett chief who was closely allied with Roger Williams, and they had the trade relationships there. And the Narragansetts and Pequots were sort of rivals, trade rivals, especially at this time.
And the Narragansetts live in Rhode Island area?
Rhode Island, yep. Okay. And so basically what happens is later that night, when a lot of the hunting party is at a different village, all of a sudden there's a palisade, so like pointed sticks surrounding this whole village, and then two entrances on either side. John Underhill and I think it's John Mason. They each take each of them take an entrance and go in and start fighting. The fighting is fairly intense for a little bit, and that's why I mentioned it earlier. They wanted to try to capture provisions and corn, but the fighting was too. They realized they weren't going to be able to do it because some soldiers weren't coming out of they didn't want to go hut to hut, basically. Mm-hmm. And so John Mason gives the order to just torch the whole thing, and it creates a giant blaze. And some of the Pequots try to leave and get through the circle of English attackers, but the Narragansetts are behind them and pick off anybody who gets through. And I think a couple people survived it, but generally it was a complete massacre. And this turned off a lot of the Narragansett allies to the English, because they're like, we didn't sign up for this. We didn't think it was going to be this brutal. Fighting between indigenous groups was not really similar to fighting as the colonists knew it. It was a lot less brutal, a lot less deadly. And there's a few of the histories I mentioned, like this was where the native people realized, like, this is something different that we're dealing with.
Okay, so I guess, so maybe one way to put it would be that inter-tribe fighting is more about just kind of establishing boundaries as opposed to settler colonialist aims, which are eliminationist, because you got to wipe them out in order to really take the place, if you want to claim it as your own.
Yeah. I would say they thought it was a more economically and trade relationship, and then afterwards, though, the Narragansetts, and I haven't gotten to this part in my close studies, but the Narragansetts were marked out. I think it was King Philip's War, that they were the tribe that the colonists had to deal with. So these aren't permanent victories for these groups, because, and it's mentioned, like the colonists develop a sort of, this is where you start to trace the development of a sort of white or Christian identity in the United States.
Okay. So did the Narragansetts, at any point, I guess before King Philip's War, did it occur to them that, well, if they're here to claim this land as their own, it's only going to be a matter of time before they want to take us out? Did that? I think
pretty much immediately after the Pequots were wiped out, things started souring between the Narragansetts and even Rhode Island.
How many Pequots survived the massacre the Mystic Massacre?
Ooh, I'm not sure because there was another area, another village that wasn't obviously attacked. I'm not sure how many survived out there, but I do know that there was a treaty signed that said that they can no longer refer to themselves as Pequots, and that was when the name of the river was changed as well. And they basically disbanded. And initially, this has changed in the last 50 years or so, but we're told to go with, we're not told, but basically disbanded and melted in with groups like the Mohawks and stuff. The Pequot tribe is pretty happening in Connecticut right now. I don't know a super amount of history. I've seen some documentaries on stuff on YouTube about the reemergence of that, but I won't get into that now.
Would you call this, like, I guess from the settlers' point, did they think of this as genocide, or like what did they like? Well, I call it genocide, but what allowed them to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there was a lot. There's a quote by one, I think, an English person that's like, it would have been nice if you converted some before you had killed any, and then I think Underhill, or maybe it's Mason or one of the other captains, said, God says sometimes women need to die with their children or whatever. I can't remember the exact Bible quote, but they turn to religious reasoning in both ways, and it leads to like a more aggressive missionary effort afterwards by the people with guilty consciences, and which also doesn't end up terribly well.
And so the Pequots disbanded, and so the war lasted 2 years?
Yeah, it was pretty quick. Basically, you have the Mystic Massacre, and then a bunch of, and the remaining tribes are sort of hunted down. This is described by historian Alan Taylor as mop-up operations. There's a swamp. They're surrounded in a swamp. I don't think it's called the Dismal Swamp, but it's described as a dismal swamp. And the English are said, hey, anybody who hasn't killed Englishmen can come out and be saved. And eventually it just leads to another massacre in the swamp. And a lot of the, basically any of the survivors that were captured, if they were men, particularly, they'd be traded for slaves. And there's documentation to this. Traded for slaves in the Caribbean, and the women and children were dispersed out by John Winthrop and those types of guys for domestic helpers.
So they were sent to the Caribbean to be slaves, or how did that work?
Yeah, they're sent there to be slaves, and also slash trade for slaves and things that can be bought on with the slave markets. I'm not sure exactly what they got in return, but they wanted to bring up some African slaves to New England in exchange for Pequots.
Why? Like, what's the point of exchanging one group of slaves for another? Is it because people from Africa are they're not familiar with this place? It's going to be harder for them to resist or maintain.
Yeah, that's a lot of it, right?
Okay.
Like
germs.
Well, it's a lot less. The revolt is a lot less worrisome if they don't have a tribe out there to assist them,
right? That
sort of thing.
Okay.
And there's also you're developing like sort of racialized ideas about which labor, who can do what labor, and that sort of things too. And I think there was, when I was reading it, it just reads like they felt like they had a good thing going on in the Caribbean, and this can be our part of it.
They wanted to contribute or maybe become stakeholders. Yeah. Okay.
But
right.
Did Africans also survive better with these germs? So it was more, sorry for the crude analogy,
right,
for their buck?
Well, it would be, because they would be more exposed to those diseases that had been on the Eurasian continent.
Oh, yeah, right? Yeah. And the, like, specifically the thing with, like, the way livestock was handled in European cities in that time generally created a lot of disease. So, that makes a lot of sense.
And the cost of producing and recording We need your help. Please become a patron. It is as cheap as $5 a month, and you get exclusive access to all our patron-only content. To become a patron, go to http://www.patreon.com/historic_Lee.
Were there any contemporary or little bit post-contemporary literature that was written about the Pequot Wars? If so, like what side, like through whose point of view did they write it?
Oh yeah, there's it's all the type of people you'd think. So I think Underhill writes a story about it. Winthrop and Bradford, I believe, mention it, and these are all men of state, and they all basically, without exception, write it in a way that favors them. Winthrop, especially, academics have noted that it's very rare that a treaty that he signed ends up outliving him, so they end up disappearing, or we just have no idea what happened, or there's very clearly were other clauses that weren't written down on the public one. And yeah, it's pretty amazing how to see like sort of who gets to write the history, and then to see the effect of that history, that bent history or misleading history on how society develops after that.
I'm curious, the justification, like using religion and seeing it all as this sort of, I guess, spiritual battle between God and the devil, you know, sort of using, I guess, like earthly agents is all. I mean, I think a lot of us are somewhat familiar with that, but I've always wondered how much of their own BS did they believe at the time, and how much it was like were they coming up with this in real time, or did they kind of come up with a good story afterwards? How much? I think it's the latter for a lot of them.
Okay. And I wish I had the citation a bit better. It's either one or Mason or Underhill, but there's a YouTube video I can maybe send to Isha after this, where a guy's going through it and he's mentioning how the first private draft has a lot less mention of God. It's much more matter of fact. And then when it was drafted for public consumption, it's like, and then God allowed this, and then this happened because of God's providence and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that suspicion is the right one to have.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I tend to assume huge material interest for any sort of conflict in history, and I've always sort of suspected that people do what they want or take what they want or do what they feel they need to do, and afterwards they, you know, figure out a way to rationalize it. But I've always wondered about I assume the cynicism, but I've always wondered how much sincerity was mixed in.
Right, exactly.
So I guess how was there any version of the story from the Pequot side? Like, did any of that survive or no?
Ooh, that's a good question. Specifically from the Pequot side, I'm not certain. Although I imagine, you know, the other tribes that witnessed it were talking about it, and what it portended for the type of warfare that they were going to experience with English colonists. Yeah, with regards to specific stories, you know, I'm not sure. I've heard a couple of current Pequot Indians on YouTube talk about how, you know, when they were told the story, before they looked into the actual chronology of it, they thought it happened like the way that how vividly they were told it felt like it happened, you know, 70 years ago. So it's clearly lived on within the oral traditions, but I'm not sure any specific documents or documentation of it.
So in your podcast, which book or do you read or analyze for the Pequot Wars? And was it fiction or non-fiction?
It's a fiction book called Hope Leslie by Catherine Maria Sedgwick. She's a sort of early novelist. She's written around the time James Fenimore Cooper is, but she's much more forgotten than he is. I think at least this book is as good as what I've read from James Fenimore Cooper. But it's called Hope Leslie. It includes a main character, a girl named Maga Wiska, who is a daughter she's a Pequot girl that survives the Mystic Massacre, and then tells her adoptive, in quotes, also the family that she's given to be a servant for, tells them about the massacre from her eyes. And it's a very interesting story. I'm actually recording the part 2 of it in a couple of hours. So.
Oh, okay. That makes, and this is completely fiction, right?
Yep. Well, it's an interesting mix of fiction and it's written in 1827, and Sedgwick actually herself changes the order a bit around in the inciting the deaths, like, of the traders. She plays with history in an interesting way that I think is sophisticated enough to say that maybe we shouldn't necessarily trust it from the Winthrops and Bradfords of the world.
Okay. And so, then the colonists just continued to live there after the massacre of the Pequots, like just like before, or did anything change with them?
I think you basically have it carries on, with trading and building new settlements until the next outbreak with the next tribe, basically, and until you get to the point of where Last of the Mohicans is written, when they're the sort of mythologized premise there is that the Native Americans are completely gone, which is, as we know, not true. But that's sort of especially in the Northeast, it's a pretty fast progression out of there for them, I think.
Okay.
So was it at any point did the Narragansetts and, I don't know, the Mohawks and the other Iroquois nations all get together and say, okay, all right, they're clearly here to wipe us out. They're not going anywhere. We need to wipe them out. It's them or us.
Yeah, I don't know any. I can't name any of the specific figures. I haven't gotten this deep into the history yet, but this is where I'm going next. And I know there were at least a couple of figures that were saying this. We need to unite because this isn't going to be good for us. We can't, rely on the Dutch or something like that, because eventually they realize that the English are going to side with each other. Right.
None of these people are your friends. They all have opposing interests. I guess I've just wondered why they never did it. Why did they not totally wipe out the English?
I think the answer is trade relationships. It's divide and conquer, right? Like if we can promise this to such and such, because these tribes weren't, they weren't centrally planned, right? They were They had different levels of sachems and things like that, but you couldn't. It wasn't like under a king, so it couldn't be like, hey, nobody do this from now on. And so if we can offer, hey, you can have access to this valley to hunt that was formerly under some sort of maybe competitor, you don't. I think that's probably how that worked. I think trade and material benefit was material incentive was probably what led to that.
And I guess there wasn't some sort of cohesive identity that transcended tribe or anything like that. They were all independent nations.
I think that was a project that certain figures believed they would be nice, but I don't think it ever got off the ground enough to present a super serious challenge. But I could be wrong or underselling some of that stuff.
And so, go ahead, JD.
No, go ahead.
No, I don't have one. Go ahead.
So early on, and this is kind of stepping back a bit in time, there was a lot of colonists who would join indigenous tribes, and it was eventually became a problem in the eyes of the powers that be, that they started punishing people. And obviously this is because the indigenous population they obviously knew how to, plant things right and not die from preventable diseases. But what was at first what would encourage people to go join indigenous tribes, besides like the obvious not starving to death part?
I don't know specifically the just I'm going to leave and go join a tribe. I know Sedgwick, the author of Hope Leslie that I mentioned earlier, she had a relation who died 4 years before she was born, but named Eunice Williams, who was in 1704 abducted by Mohawks, I believe. It was a French and Indian war party, French and some Mohawk Indians, and Eunice and her father and a few of her siblings were captured, and the rest of her family was ransomed by the governor. But Eunice fell in love with one of a Mohawk boy, and married in 1713, and didn't ever want to leave. She just she adopted the culture, and I'm not really sure what it is. It seems like the examples seem to be more female. So it seems like women, and this is just conjecture, or speculation based on what I've read, but a lot of it seems to be women preferring that lifestyle than at least men or English men, basically. So I'm not sure.
That makes sense because from when looking into this, apparently tribes had a lot more egalitarian view on gender, or a lot more progressive for the time.
Yeah, and there was a labor split along gender lines there too, but it wasn't women's labor wasn't devalued like it was in English as much as it was in the English patriarchal sort of context.
What would you attribute that to?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's a tough one. A lot of things, maybe. Go on, Aisha.
After the Treaty of Hartford, is that the one that I heard that there was an order to hunt, just kill any Pequot who still refer to themselves as Pequot? Right?
That's basically the explicitly genocidal treaty. Yeah, where it's like they can't call themselves Pequods anymore. And
how would they know if someone is calling them themselves a Pequod, or is this just a on paper, this is our excuse for wiping out whoever?
I think it's the sort of thing like if someone's going around calling themselves a Pequod, then we got problems in our hands, and we're going to send some people to fix that. I think it's a political thing, right? Like, don't identify yourself as a socialist, almost, right?
Right. Okay.
So
don't fly that flag, basically.
Sorry, were these colonists trained military men, or were they just ordinary people with guns?
A lot of them were actually trained military men. Underhill and Mason. There were some regular people who weren't military at all, but there was a fair amount of. And I don't know the European context as well for this, but I think there's a lot of war fighting that led up, preceded this even, that where a lot of these guys sort of developed their skills.
And how did mainland England or the Queen see this conflict as? Did she approve, disapprove? She didn't know about it?
Ooh, I think that's a complicated answer that I don't have a complicated question. I don't want to speak on that because I don't know well enough.
Would you say that, I guess, maybe just broadly speaking, in terms of settler colonial efforts over here, that they often involved a measure of plausible deniability, or just like the monarch conveniently doesn't know a lot of the details, stuff like that? Or
I wonder, because sometimes it's the monarch that's actually that's restraining the colonists a little bit.
Interesting.
So I don't know. It's hard to say exactly which. I mean, to be honest, power will hide behind whatever is most available to. So if it needs to say that this is the Queen's fault, then they say that. If they need to say the Queen didn't know about this, then they can say that too. And who really knows?
Right.
I don't know.
Oh, by the way, we can go back to the Pequot Wars a little bit later. But while I still have you with the time, can you talk about the Wampanoag and Donald Trump's personal beef with the Wampanoag?
Wait, what?
Oh,
What?
Yeah, just listen to that.
Okay.
yeah. I'm sorry. I meant to look into this a bit deeper before, but basically, what's happened is Trump was having, I think, a land dispute. Isha, I don't know how much you looked into this either. In the 80s or early 90s, and he was trying to get access to either some land or get a tribal recognition removed. And his basic argument was that they didn't look Native American to him. And there's some pretty characteristically disgusting footage of Trump in the 90s saying just awful things about how Indian people look and how they're clearly scamming the government and that sort of thing. It's
But last month, the Wampanoag got their status as a tribe rescinded from the U.S. government. So now they're no longer. I wonder if it's related conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the sort of thing where I don't know if Trump has the memory, but if he has a memory for anything stemming that long ago, it's probably like people who. One, both, he's racist against, and two, slighted him. So it's possible.
Right. He's got a pristine memory for grudges, that's for sure. That seems to be the one thing.
Right.
God.
Exactly.
Good God.
Whose phone is that? And so it seems and after the Pequot War, things that were lying low for about a while until the King Philip's War, right?
Yeah, I think it got uneasy though. I think it was a very uneasy peace. I think the Mystic Massacre had a huge impact on how the indigenous people viewed the colonists, and I would say not necessarily peaceful, but guarded, like a guarded peace after that.
With King Philip War, didn't his head get cut off and put on a stake and left there for? When I was reading on this, it said decades, but is that a myth or is that like?
I'm not sure. I'm not there yet.
Oh, okay. And I forgot. Oh, yeah. And so, what happened to the I can't remember their names, but the ones who were belligerent against the Pequot, like the ones who cooperated.
The Narragansetts.
Narragansetts. What happened to them?
I mean, they had a relationship with Roger Williams in Providence, and he was he was exiled by the Massachusetts, but then later he'd become sort of their contact with the Native Americans. So when in the lead up to the Pequot War, they'd ask Roger Williams like, "Hey, what's going on with them? Why are they gonna are we gonna be able to like whenever there's trouble?" Roger Williams was their contact guy, and I think basically like he worked to try to make that keep a relatively safe and calm relationship with the Narragansetts, but ultimately it didn't last.
And were the Narragansett part of the peace treaty of Hartford too?
That's a good question. I can just look that up here. I think they might have been. Let's see. Yeah, it was between the English, the Mohegan, and the Narragansett, basically. And let's see if I can see who the Narragansett sachem was. Yeah, it doesn't have it here, but yeah, basically. Hey, Isha, we have to actually do something on the internet here, so if we can wrap up in like 5-10.
Oh yeah, okay? No, actually we can. Okay, in that case, the last question is: can you tell me about your favorite, since you do JFK, like Nixon tapes and this? Can you tell me about what's your theory on the JFK assassination?
My theory on the JFK assassination is that I'm genuinely, I try not to get bogged down in the whole ballistics of Dealey Plaza. Did Oswald shoot it? Was the shooter, that sort of thing? I think that there's enough ambiguous and sort of suspicious things going on in the bureaucracy of, like, say, the CIA, that makes me suspect that it's very possible that there were hit squads that comprised of either mafia related or right-wing Cuban related and CIA related assets that wanted to kill Kennedy. And the reasons I think I'm most sold on is I've read some books talking about, I don't think Kennedy wanted necessarily to be a super peacenik, but I think the Bay of Pigs really pissed off a lot of people. I think his sympathy with, like, Patrice Lumumba and African national movement was also upsetting a lot of people. And then there was also I think it was an oil allowance that was pissing off a lot of people. And so I think my general thing is there were assassinations of head of state going on all over the world at this point in time. And to dismiss the possibility that America was the victim of one of those is just American exceptionalism.
Right. The idea that Allen Dulles would consider one head of state sacred, or a particular American institution sacred, especially when he harbors a grudge.
And I've also heard an interesting theory that it might have been a Secret Service agent that accidentally shot Kennedy as a motorcade sped up.
Yeah,
and that would explain, like, the weird bullet trajectories and the smell of gunpowder on the ground.
Yeah,
and I mean,
I'm less convinced by that one because I actually buy the trajectories stuff. I mean, I've been to Dealey Plaza. It does not seem impossible to me that, like, I don't think you need a magic bullet, actually. And that, to be honest, that's one of the things that I really don't like about the Oliver Stone movie is I think it spends way too much time on that nonsense. When really, I want to know what was Oswald doing at the U-2 base in Japan, right? Like, those are the interesting questions, not.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and since you're such a history buff, I'm sure we'll have you on again.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Is there anything you would like to plug?
No. Yeah, just check out Literary Hangover Podcast. YouTube, wherever podcasts are found.
We already did, that was the first thing we did, JD.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I'm just covering all bases.
Have a good Thanksgiving, and I think we're trying to release this episode on Thanksgiving as the true story of Thanksgiving.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys very much.
Okay,
thanks a lot, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Bye. Okay, I think this went really well.
Yeah, this was good, and I didn't realize you were having him on, Isha. That's cool.
Okay, because of the Pequot Wars and the true story of Thanksgiving. Brandon. Okay, we need an intro. JD, can you do an introduction saying this is and Brandon or something like that?
Yeah, this is how's it going, comrades? You are listening to Historically, a show where we